It says we're live, but not on my other screen yet. Okay, so I'm pretty sure we're live on Facebook. That's what my notifications are telling me. I love that my phone is telling me I should tune into the live stream because Parents' Voice has gone live. It's like, I know, I'm here. Joining us today for our third book chat with an author here at Parents' Voice is Saffron Howden. And we'll probably start with, Saffron, do you want to just give us a brief, introduce yourself a little bit? I mean, we know about you, but there'll be some former readers of Crinkling News in the audience, hopefully, but some who have never heard of it. So let's,
Sure.
Introduce yourself.
So first of all, thank you very, very much for having me today, and to anyone who's listening. As I was just saying, this is our very first interview about our book, Kid Reporter, The Secret to Breaking News. It's not actually published yet. In fact, we handed our manuscript into our publisher, New South, only a few weeks ago. So we're going through the editing process, but really, really excited about it. So I am a journalist of almost 20 years. I've worked at places like the Sydney Morning Herald and the Daily Telegraph. AAP is where I started my career as a journalist, Australian Associated Press, which is the national newswire. And then after I left the Sydney Morning Herald, where I'd been for quite some time, my husband and I, who's a graphic designer and worked in newspapers as well, decided to launch a national newspaper for children, which was Crinkling News. And we were really of the belief that kids have a right to have access to the news, that they're curious about the world around them. And most news, as we all know, is produced for adults. So it's not produced in a way that's relevant to kids and involves them and uses their voices, and is also age appropriate. So we launched a national printed newspaper for children. You can see one of our front pages behind me here. And we ran that for 2 years. And out of that, I did a lot of work around media literacy and sort of became a real, national media literacy advocate. We hosted the first national media literacy conference for young people as part of what we did at Crinkling News. And of course, such a huge issue for parents and teachers and young people at the moment, the deluge of information that comes at all of us every day, particularly difficult for young people and kids. While they're trying to grow up, they're also trying to process that deluge. One of our key senior writers on Crinkling News, it was written for children, but it was almost all produced by professional journalists, was Dana Quinn. And Dana came to me after we'd stopped publishing Crinkling News on a day-to-day basis and said, we should write a book together. I'm like, that's a great idea. And so we sort of workshopped a lot of different ideas and finally came up with this idea. There'd been so much interest among young people who read Crinkling News in being involved, wanting to be journalists themselves and go out there and report. We thought, let's provide a handbook for young people so that they can become journalists. They can start school newspapers, start a school podcast or a community newspaper. Even, if you're really ambitious, start a TV-style news program that you can, run on Instagram or YouTube or the school website, So that's sort of how we came to be why I'm here today. And this is where that was the path.
Yes, I can tell you that quite a number of people tagged me and tagged Parents' Voice when the news started to come out that you'd written the book, because they knew that we were big fans of Crinkling News and the work that you'd done. And I can say that a couple of Parents' Voice stories got featured in Crinkling News over the years. And we were really, I know that we were quite devastated here at the, Parents' Voice headquarters, so to speak, which for people outside of Melbourne is currently in my house because we're in lockdown here in Melbourne. With my children on the other side, they're under, pain of, I don't know, I won't say what I threatened them with, but to stay absolutely quiet, but they're right on the other side of the wall. you know, that we were quite sad to hear Crinkling News was wrapping up. And I've seen conversations since between people online about how do kids engage with media in an appropriate way at the moment. They get kids who really want to know, you know, keep up to date with current news and current affairs, but they're concerned about the impact that has on kids if they sit and watch, say, adult news programs or read newspapers that are directed at adults. So it was an amazing thing. And I think that this new book sounds fantastic and is perfect for those parents helping guide, you know, budding journalists. So in terms of guiding people, we go back to your beginning. How did you become a journalist? Like, what was your passion?
Yeah, well, I'm one of those really probably almost textbook cases of journalists. I think I wanted to be a journalist from about the age of 11. If Crinkling News had existed when I was a child, nothing would have stopped me from being involved in a printed weekly newspaper for kids and for young people generally. So I wanted to be a journalist from a really young age. I knew that that's what I wanted to do. I loved writing. I was really curious. I think that's a key thing to being a journalist for, you know, a young person, a child, and a, you know, professional journalist adult, that being really curious, having questions about the way things work and why things are so. I grew up in a family where we discussed current affairs all the time, and I'm so glad that I grew up in that type of household. That made me really interested about what was going on in the world. I think, though, as a child, you feel very powerless in a way. You hear about the things that are going on, and more so than when I was growing up, because it's impossible to really stay away from the news of the day. It's not just sort of on the 6 o'clock news and in the newspaper anymore. It's online. It's everywhere. It's on social media. And you feel like there's no voice for you in there. And I think this is one of the key things we're also trying to do with this book. And I think it really goes above and beyond, you know, young people who sort of desperately want to become journalists. It's about having a voice. And I think that was one of the key things that drove Crinkling News as well, was saying just because you can't vote yet doesn't mean that your opinion isn't valuable. And I think now more than ever, while we're going through this pandemic, it's so important to give young people a legitimate, serious voice in the national conversation. And if that's, you know, by producing a, you know, newspaper with your friends, or in a club at school, or, you know, in conjunction with your parents or a teacher, or, you know, if it's by writing opinion pieces, writing letters to the, you know, the editor of the local paper. These are the kinds of things that we talk about in Crinkling News. And it's certainly, when I was growing up and sort of, you know, waiting for the day when I'd be a foreign correspondent reporting on from war zones, which I never did, by the way. I grew up and went, that sounds really scary. I'd like to report on politics in Australia, thanks. I think Dana's and my idea is also with the book to give, and with the newspaper, it was to give young people a genuine avenue to be a part of that conversation and to have a meaningful impact on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can relate to some of that. I mean, obviously, I'm not a journalist, and it wasn't the journey that I took, but I always watched, you know, pop culture and the American shows where they've got the newspaper in the high schools. And I always watched that with like a sense of jealousy. I'm like, why doesn't my high school have that? Why didn't we have that? Like this idea that was nurtured. And I'm, you know, obviously not American. I actually have never visited. So I don't know how true this representation of American high schools is, that they have these newspapers. But I always thought, you know, that's that nurturing of students and saying that their voice has meaning and matter, you know, that they can have an impact and report on what's happening, and that also that the things that they're doing are important enough to be written about as news, that people care what's happening in their local environments as too. I think, such as a duality there. So you've spoken a little bit about the impact that you're hoping your book will have, and it's about that nurturing of kids as I like the phrase citizen journalists. I love that idea. Is there anything like, what can you speak more to that impact or?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I obviously don't want to give it away. Our book isn't actually published until early 2021. I think we're hoping for just before the beginning of first term next year. But I think one thing that's really important and will hopefully resonate with people involved in Parents' Voice is that we do touch on a lot of that media literacy as well, which at the moment is sometimes, depending on the school you go to and the state you're in, you get a little bit of the curriculum touches on media literacy and media studies. I think that it's a life skill. It's something that all of our children and young people should be really well versed in well before they become adults, particularly because of that deluge of information. So we do talk about that a bit as well. And I think one of the things about becoming more media literate is creating media yourself. And that's one of the really big ideas behind this book as well, is giving young people and children the tools to create that media. Because when you learn how to do it yourself, you're much more critical about other media that you consume.
Yeah.
And that's, we go sort of through the sort of very practical but the broad ideas behind media literacy in the book. And by the way, the book is written for young people as the audience, so it can definitely be used by parents and teachers or in conjunction with young people, but it's deliberately using a voice like we did with Crinkling News, where our audience are young people and children. Creating media is a surefire route to becoming more media literate. And so that means that at the heart of that is really critical thinking. Putting on the way I always think about it is when you're consuming media, putting on different hats, where, you can be looking at an advertisement, be conscious that you're looking at an advertisement and think about that in a different way from when you read a news story or you watch a movie or you play a video game. Consuming it in a different way and thinking about it in a different way, knowing that someone is trying to sell you something versus someone's trying to inform you or, make you happy or make you sad or entertain you, Yeah. So we go through that in the book as well. And that feeds into a lot of the work I've done during Crinkling News and since, where I've been on the Media Literacy Advisory Group for the Alana and Madeline Foundation. Yep. Which has just produced a media literacy tool for high school students, a national tool, but of course the foundation is based in Victoria. And that feeds a lot into that as well. And I think this book is really practical, really deliberately. So I know, being a mother myself, and then, spending so much time thinking about communicating with young people and children, really conscious of making those lessons just a really intuitive part of something that is fun and interesting anyway, Yeah. So the book is really practical, but built into that is hopefully an understanding of the media landscape generally, and how each type of medium feeds into that and the impact that it has too.
Excellent. Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, and I know that I've had a bit of a look at the new tool that the Alana and Madeline Foundation produced. And for those, watching at home, Parents' Voice actually has a connection. The former chair of Parents' Voice is now over at working at the Alana and Madeline Foundation. So there's all sorts of connections in this space. But I often think about the amount of ads that are in things like YouTube videos and things, not necessarily ads beforehand, but actually in the videos that my kids are consuming, and simple things like Instagram influencers and that impact that it has, and that lack of understanding that kids have that this is an ad and that it's being sold to them. And so obviously a lot of the general work Parents' Voice does is around that kind of traditional form of advertising, because kids struggle to differentiate those different types of medium because their brains are still developing, etc. But it's become so much more murky than it used to be. Like, it's even harder, and it's hard even for adults to differentiate that, I think.
Absolutely. And I think it's, one of the things I really like about journalism, and of course I'm ridiculously biased because that's what I've done with my whole adult life, but I guess it makes you, well, you're very naturally a critical thinker. It's part of your job on a day-to-day basis to question whether things are true, where they're coming from, who said it, why, what's their motivation. And so I think hopefully that's one of the reasons why a journalist is quite a good person to teach some of those skills, because I've done it as part of my job every day, for the last 20 years, is to question things. And you don't have to do that in a way that is, some journalists, the traditional sort of view of journalists is they're all a bit jaded and, don't believe in anything. I've got a much more positive view of journalism. I think that it's empowering to know how to sort of consume different bits of information and be much more sure about what you do with that. It gives you a feeling that you've got some control, and I think that media literacy is, that's why it's so important. You don't feel like you're at sea, sort of being buffeted from, one place to the next, being told, no, believe this, and no, this is wrong. When you're a critical thinker and you've learned those skills, then you go, well, actually, I've researched that, or I know how to approach that, and I come to this decision in an informed way. I've got a good idea of what's behind it, and I'm not just sort of being pulled by my emotions, which is a huge part of social media. It's emotion driven, and so Dana and I really wanted in this book as well, not to just teach these fantastic practical things. Like, it's pretty much a handbook. Like, for instance, if you want to set up a school newspaper, we take you step by step through how to do that, what resources you'll need, the things you'll have to consider, from how many people do you need on something like that, to have you considered printing costs, or is it going to be, delivered electronically? Will you need to fundraise, down to, have you thought about a title? So all those things we try to go across. And I should mention as well, my co-author, of course, Dana, is also a journalist. So she, apart from her role with Crinkling News as a senior writer, she once worked for BTN. So we've got a behind the news, that is, on the ABC. So we've both got a long history of producing news professionally for adults, but also for children. So we try to bring all of that experience to the book.
Excellent. Well, and that kind of segues really nicely into the first question that's been sent through to me, which is, so it started with a compliment, which was, we need Crinkling News now more than ever, which, I suppose that doesn't help you now, but, there's a whole lot of supporters out there. The question being, what other user-friendly media outlets exist in Australia? Or so this question, it kind of said also Victoria. So I didn't say Saffron's actually coming to us from the Blue Mountains. So Parents' Voice is national, but we do have a kind of more substantial membership here in Victoria. But, here we are branching out and inviting speaking across the borders, which do we have an exemption? I suppose we're fine. So what other kind of media outlets would you recommend that parents could use with their kids, or kids can consume?
Look, it is really tough in Australia. By the way, you were right about the United States. Much more common to have school newspapers by student-run newspapers in the United States. And in fact, we spoke to quite a few students who'd run newspapers in the States, high school students and so forth, as well as a lot in Australia, by the way. So there isn't a lot. That's the short answer. That's why we created Crinkling News. So there is, of course, Behind the News on the ABC, which has been running for, over 50 years now. That is very much for basically upper primary, I think, is my best understanding of Behind the News. So and it's televised and it's during school hours, so it's quite different from that sort of reading print newspaper experience. Shortly after Crinkling News, we stopped publishing Crinkling News. News Corp did launch nationally a digital news service, which is based in Victoria, but I think it's now national. And I think that's called Kids News. So there is that. That's, again, very tied in with school curriculum. So quite different from Crinkling News. It's sort of, they do things, from the last time I looked at it, they do things like put the definitions of words that might be tricky at the bottom. We deliberately avoided things like that with Crinkling News because we wanted kids to just engage with the news and feel like it wasn't a lesson, that it was just the news. But they do exist. There's a podcast called Squiz Kids, which is only recently launched. Those are the only ones I can think of in Australia, and I'm pretty sure that's it, particularly with a national reach. But I think the best thing to do is for young people to create their own, and then they will automatically start thinking about things. And it also sparks discussions with parents.
Yeah, absolutely. I was reflecting as you were talking about critical thinking earlier that the other benefit is critical thinkers are more interesting people, in my opinion. Like at one point I worked with a whole bunch of scientists, and they were all fascinating because they could come to things from so many different angles, and their minds were also open to being challenged by new evidence and things because they thought about things from that critical kind of scientific point of view. And so it meant you could have great conversations that weren't, people had emotion, but they also were able to accept new ideas. And they would be also quite free flowing.
Yeah, well, my perhaps that was one of the reasons I went to journalism, because my father was a scientist. So we had that critical thinking lens, probably when we were discussing news of the day around the dinner table every night. And by the way, that's the other thing I'd say to parents listening is do discuss, in the absence of Crinkling News, and yeah, we're devastated too, but do discuss the news with your children. It's really important. That I think things are much scarier when you know nothing about them. If you break it down and you say, well, this has happened, and you do it in an appropriate way, it's much better that young people feel empowered with knowledge than to say, don't think about it, don't look at it, don't touch it, don't talk about it. I think it's much better to, in an age appropriate way, to say, well, this is what's happened, and what do you think about it? How do you feel about it? Get them talking about it.
Yeah, well, and that goes quite neatly into the next question I have, which is, how do you think we can support parents to share relevant media with children?
Yeah, so that's the biggest one, I think. Although I always say these things conscious as a mother that who's got time to digest all the news and then think about how you could appropriately talk about that with your kids. So don't feel bad if you're not reaching, 100% on that one. I think that is the main one, though. Them discussing, young people discussing current affairs and news with people they trust and that you trust, and being able to particularly be able to have a safe space to ask questions, I think is a really important thing. I think there are ways to consume the news that don't expose young people, like particularly young kids, to stuff you wouldn't want them to see, which they're definitely too young for. So, as you can probably imagine, my 7-year-old is quite into the news and can hardly avoid it in our household. And so we will sometimes watch things that so one of the things we do is on the weekend she does the crossword with me in the newspaper. So, and then she's getting the sense of the news, and we might talk about a few articles, but she's not sitting there with it in front of her and maybe by mistake, stumbling across an article, about abuse of some kind or a murder trial or something like that, which I wouldn't want. And so we do those kinds of things, and we do the 9-letter word and all that kind of stuff. And then, age appropriate shows. Occasionally I'll show her a clip from, some sort of, like a, from a satirical show or something, one that's appropriate, and then we'll talk about it. So you can always sort of take snippets out of the news to discuss. And because there are so many clips around these days on social media, you don't even have to, find the show somewhere, a recording of it, or go to iView and find the relevant moment, you can generally find a fair bit that I can just show her on the phone or talk to her about. So that's another way that I do it. And then, of course, I would encourage, there was a great segment, I don't know if anyone saw it, on 7:30 on the ABC the other night with a 10-year-old who'd started their own newspaper. And I think, it was a sort of COVID newsletter, I think. And that kind of thing can be great for kids and young people to process something which is otherwise really scary and keeping them locked inside their homes, to actually go, right, what's happening? Well, I'm going to write it all down, and I'm going to, we're all in lockdown at the moment. I'm going to go put it into a newsletter, and I'm going to send it to my teacher or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
I think that involvement is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure a number of parents listening in will have had similar experiences to me with the kids with the big questions as they're meant to be going to sleep, right? It's always when my kids come up with some random thought that they've had that they really want to discuss. It's really, I think it's, my thing is I engage with it because I'm a big sucker, but also because it's the opportunity. Often around the dinner table, my kids kind of, it's a bit of, oh yeah, sure, mum, whatever. But in the evenings, and they're sitting there thinking about stuff and they get stuck on something, knowing that they can come to me and have a chat about how they're feeling or this big thought that they've had about, existence or life or, contemporary news.
Absolutely. And I think that's the other thing that reminded me that is key, particularly with distressing news and things like the pandemic, which can be so overwhelming, is also giving young people a way to do something about it. Very important. So is that writing a letter to your local paper? Is it writing a letter to the Prime Minister or your local member? Is it, doing a poster for something? Is it, always having a way, or donating to something, doing a fundraiser, like having a way to channel how you're feeling about that is really important as well. And again, it's giving, and I feel like I'm on repeat here, but it's giving that agency and empowerment to young people. And it helps them process current affairs as well. It's a way of them being involved in it. And then, then you feel like you've got some agency and again, that sense of sort of control over the world a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Very much resonates with me. So we've got one last question, unless Evie shoots another one in the 30 seconds we have left. Very, very quickly, top 3 tips for building media literacy with primary school age children. You've got 60 seconds.
Wow, okay. Top 3. I've got 30 seconds. I would say talking about what's going on in the world. That hats analogy I find incredibly useful for primary school age kids. Okay, here's your blue hat, that's for ads. Here's your red hat, that's for, news and information. Here's your green hat, that's for, entertainment, that's for the movie you're watching. Yeah. I think it's a really nice way of going, of making it clear in your own head. And the third one, create your own media. It is really key to media literacy, and that can be as simple as creating a newspaper for mum or dad. It doesn't have to be distributed to your whole neighbourhood or community or nationwide. I think that's a really, really crucial way to address it.
Absolutely. Excellent. Well, so thank you very much for joining us, Saffron. If you give us one last pitch, I know the book doesn't come out until next year, but what's it called? When's it's planned to be released? And for people listening, we're hoping that we can continue to do these sorts of chats maybe on a more monthly basis, and we hope we'll get Saffron back when the book is closer to its release date or post-release.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's called Kid Reporter, The Secret to Breaking News, written by myself and Dana Quinn, and it's published by New South Books, and it should be out in, I think, January next year. Don't have a firm date on it, but we're very excited. I brought along the manuscript to show you all with my daughters highlighting and colouring in on it.
Yeah. Yes. It sounds like...
Thank you so much for having me. It's been fantastic having this chat.
So thank you very much for joining us. So for everyone listening, you'll know that I really haven't thought through how to end each of these videos. I need journalism training, like tune in next time with Parents' Voice. But this is the last one of our planned sessions, but we're looking at doing potentially kind of the last week of September, another one, and then running it kind of monthly, maybe broadening it out, kind of calling it Parents' Voice Chat, so a bit more general with who the guest might be. So if people have suggestions, feel free to put them in the comments of this video or email them in if you've got people you really want us to be talking to and you want to get their little, brain nuggets. And we'll be sending out an e-newsletter to all our subscribers that will include links to to the books that our authors have written. And for Saffron, I'll chat with Saffron about what she wants us to include, but we'll definitely be putting the link into the Alana and Madeline Foundation, the media literacy portal there for teenagers. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.